Welcome back to Black News Tonight. We continue with our mission of furthering respectful, engaged dialogue for the advancement of our people. As the ban against critical race theory is in full speed and the vilification of works such as the 1619 Project continues, Black America is grappling with newer terms of the proverbial culture wars, such as anti-racism, some say woke-ism, or even the true content of critical race theory. Well, we at BNT are committed to bringing you discussions of substance, civil dialogue with respectful disagreement, and honest efforts to further mutual understanding. And in that spirit, my next guest is a crucial addition to this mission. He is a public intellectual. He is a brilliant professor of economics at Brown University. Dr. Glenn Loury joins me. Thank you so much for being on Black News Tonight. It's really an honor.
Oh, thank you, Mark, for having me.
Absolutely. Let's start with this ongoing debate around teaching critical race theory in schools. The thought policing around what's assumed to be CRT and the push against teaching it in schools. A war initially raised by people like Christopher Rufo and others that's now been adapted by close to 20 GOP states. I got to tell you, man, I did not see this as in the crystal ball a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that critical race theory would be something that would be such a part of the public conversation.
Yeah, it's become a thing. I mean, when people use the phrase, they're not really referring specifically to some kind of academic doctrine. They're talking about a mood, a shift in attitude in educational circles that is putting too much, in their view, emphasis on race and racial identity and on theories about white supremacy and structural racism. So they're pushing back against that.
And what do you make about that push? What do you make of that pushback? I mean, it's a really interesting thing. As you said, critical race theory has become the kind of stand-in for all kinds of race talk. But it seems like many on the right don't want any kind of race talk.
Yeah, well, I'm against that. I'm against not having any kind of race talk. I'm against not allowing our kids to know about Tulsa 1921 or to know what happened in slavery and Jim Crow segregation. I don't think the more respectable critical race theory opponents would say don't teach about that. I think that what they would say is don't teach that your country is an intrinsically racist, white supremacist, dominating the black body, has contempt for black humanity. They would prefer that you talk the half glass full talk and that you say, well, yeah, we have had problems, including slavery and Jim Crow, but we've also had triumphs, including emancipation and the civil rights movement. You know, so it's a question of how the narrative is going to spin, and people are fighting about that, as I think it's appropriate to do for primary and secondary education.
So in your estimation, in primary and secondary education, should we have conversations about racism as an intrinsic and indeed intractable problem in American society? Should we be talking about white supremacy? Should we be unpacking this stuff?
I mean, you and I would probably not have the same curriculum. I wouldn't want to neglect the racial discrimination question, but I would want to point toward a colorblind. I know that it's in bad odor. The word is in bad odor. People think it's a small idea, but I think it's really a big idea. Point toward the fact that race is not the most important thing about us. So, I would have a different spin on it than a lot of the critical race theory people would have.
Well, critical race theory absolutely would push against what they call liberal colorblindness theory, this idea of seeing people as colorblind, or even seeing colorblindness as the ultimate goal of a society, is itself troublesome to many critical race theorists. Why do you want a colorblind approach to engaging students, but also to even society?
All right, so I've written books about this kind of thing, man. My book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, Harvard University Press is getting ready to reissue a 20th anniversary edition. And I acknowledge that the simplistic colorblind, don't see race, let's pretend that it doesn't exist, is both wrong as a matter of social science, but is also morally thin and inadequate to the task of dealing with our historical legacy. On the other hand, I think at the end of the day, the country here is of 330 million Americans only going to make progress if we see each other beyond racial category. We have to look beyond race. I agree with Clarence Thomas about this, and I didn't always agree with him about this. We need to look at the human dimension. So here, I'll just give one example if you let me, just a minute, okay? Crime, punishment in prisons. Now, blacks are overrepresented. There's too many black people in prison. There's too many people in prison. Blacks commit more crimes per portion and also have more punishment. I'm not saying there's not racism in law enforcement. I'm saying I don't want to have a conversation about black criminals playing upon white or Asian people. I don't want to have a racialized conversation about crime and punishment. I think the most important thing is to talk about the common humanity that we have here in the country and to find ways that we can work together across racial lines. I think that's the only way forward for us. And so I'm holding on to that.
I see the idea behind that. I guess the problem for me with that is that the realities that we're facing on the ground, the issues that we're wrestling with aren't colorblind. They're not race neutral. And so even when people on the left talk about, mass incarceration, I'm always like, well, it's not really mass incarceration, right? All Americans aren't being incarcerated at the same scale or scope. It's mass incarceration of poor people, mass incarceration of black and brown people. And there's a way that if we make this a raceless problem, and if we only focus on, as you say, the human aspect, that we won't keep track of the fact that it's the most vulnerable in society getting caged. I mean, don't we need to at least hold on to that as a way to determine and develop proper mechanisms for fixing it?
Well, you said it right there. You said poor, and then you said black and poor. And the fact of the matter is there's a lot of white people in prison. There are more white people than black people who are in prison, although the proportionality is higher. Most of those people in prison have poor education, have poor employment prospects, have scarred lives in terms of disadvantage of one kind or another. And if you want to fix it, and this is where I'm really, this is my real bottom line. If you want to get something done, if you want to change the institutions, you need to rally all the people behind doing so. If the conversation becomes stuck on race, we actually are a less progressive political community than if the conversation is focused on disadvantaged people who need help. Among those disadvantaged people who need help is an overrepresentation of black people. That's true. But if I want to deal with the disadvantage, whether it's healthcare, whether it's schools that's not working, whether it's law enforcement that's out of control, whether it's the lack of economic security, if I want to deal with that in a country of 330 million people, I need to be framing my claims in transracial terms, in human terms. That's the position that I'm trying to defend here.
I think, and we got to take a break in a second. I want to get your thought on this, but I guess part of the problem for me is that it seems that America can't keep track of people's humanity unless they deracialize it. In other words, they can't see me as human unless they take away the blackness in my identity. Until they can see me as non-black or raceless, they can't see my fundamental humanity, which to me is an artifact of white supremacy, as is the fact that, as you said, America writ large won't make this an American problem if it's only happening to black people. But the converse doesn't seem to be true. Nobody loves white people more than black people. And there's a whole bunch of poor people that will vote for policies and fight for policies that interest the rich, right? So there's a way that the fact that we have to make it raceless for America to care, that we have to whiten the face of poverty to make it real, or whiten, or you know what I mean? It seems to me that that's also an artifact of white supremacy, that we can only care about it if the majority of white people are being affected by it. Anyway, let me take a pause. I want you to think on that, not because you need to think on it, because I got to take a commercial break. When we come back, I'd like to get your thoughts, and we'll talk about some other stuff too. Everybody stay with me. We'll have more to discuss with Dr. Loury on the culture wars. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Black News Tonight. I'm here with economics professor and public intellectual Glenn Loury as we talk about the details of the current culture wars. Glenn, before I move on to my next question, I was sort of talking about what it means for us to have a society where we have to make it raceless for America as a whole to care. And me seeing that as evidence itself of the kind of permanence of white supremacy and racism. What do you say?
No, I thought you had a point there. I mean, it's a democracy, and the pendulum is going to be pushed around mostly by the attitudes of the majority. So that's a concession, I think, that if you're in the minority, you may have to make. Whether it's a denial of our humanity is another question altogether. I mean, I think a lot of attention is paid to racial disparity. That's what diversity, equity, and inclusion is all about. That's what affirmative action is all about. I think the amount of ink and airtime that talking about racial disparities gets and talking about race and racism gets is pretty high. I think white fragility is a term of art. I think all of the training that corporations and educational institutions are imposing on people to get them on the right page on the racial question, et cetera, et cetera. I think Barack Obama was elected twice. You get the idea. So I think you overstate the extent to which you have to make it a general thing before you'll be seen if you're a black man. Although I get where you're coming from.
Fair enough. Talk to me about cancel culture. It's a term that has emerged, and the right uses it a lot right now to decry the current moment where you can't say anything, you can't do anything, you can't make a mistake without having your whole life ruined, without being erased from the public sphere. First of all, do you agree with this idea of cancel culture, that it exists?
Yeah, I agree that it exists and has existed for a long time. I remember I actually was alive when McCarthyism was a thing. I don't remember it, but I have read about it. That is to say, punishing people for being out of step with fashionable opinion and excising them, not cutting them off, not doing business with them, canceling them, has been going on for a long time. I think you find it in a lot of different places. But I think of late, because the left, if you let me use that term, controls institutions where cancellation is very prominent, like the universities or some places in the media and so forth. The right finds itself complaining more because they're on the losing end more. But I don't think the phenomenon of trying to hurt by cutting off dealing with people who I disagree with, that kind of thing, is limited to the left.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing for me. It feels to me that the right only sort of complains about cancel culture when they're losing the battle, right? When you have the moral majority, when you have folk I'm thinking about the 80s and the 90s where people wanted to ban the Teletubbies. They wanted to cancel people on television for having gay couples, or even the insinuation of queer identity. You had people smashing rap CDs. And some people on the left did that too. The Tipper Gores of the world certainly weren't immune to that as well. But it seemed to me that they were always dictating who could exist and who couldn't. And even now, even in I'm watching the Letter to Harper's and all this stuff where people are saying, oh my God, we can't say anything, we can't do anything. But the right still continues to want to cancel academics who are anti-Zionist, right? So there seems to be a way that to me the right overstates how much control they don't have over the culture wars and over this practice of so-called canceling. And then there's another piece, and I want to get your response to this. It seems to me that sometimes what they're calling cancellation is really just accountability, right? That maybe sometimes you do have to get held accountable for atrocious positions on things.
Yeah, I'm smiling because if my wife were here, she'd be smiling, because this is what she's been saying to me for a long time. So you conservatives always complain about cancel is just because your ox is being gored. Y'all been canceling since forever, she would say. And there is merit in that observation. But I'm in the university, man. When Charles Murray, who is a guy that believes in IQ, cannot give a lecture at a university without being attacked. When the commissioner of police in New York City cannot come to a university and make a speech without being shut down by shouting mobs. When a writer for City Journal magazine, Heather McDonald, cannot go on a university and talk about her theories without having the campus security have to escort her out the back door, that's a threat to the integrity of these institutions. So I speak now as a professor. I agree that cancellation is going on all over the place by all kinds of people, but I'm trying to protect the integrity of the institutions that I cherish. And these are places where people should be able to come, talk about their ideas, whatever they are, and have it argued out on the basis of the evidence and the reason. And that's what a university is for. So, and then there are, excuse me, but just for a minute. I mean, there are cases where people have just basically said something that was a little off color. You say accountability, true enough. Axe murderers should be held responsible for axe murder. Blatant racists should have to pay the piper. But if you're Donald McNeil at the New York Times and you happen to use the N-word in an inappropriate context somehow, and your whole career of 40 years gets thrown in your face because people decide they wanted to cancel you, well, you have a beef.
Okay, I mean, that's a fair point. Another example comes up before we go. Nicole Hannah-Jones, University of North Carolina. She's certainly someone who's been canceled not by the left, but by the right. And it seems, by all accounts, that the decision to not grant her tenure, despite her having a very tenurable file, both by journalism department standards around the country, but certainly by UNC's journalism department, where she's an alum, it seems to me that it's entirely because of the 1619 Project and people having a disagreement with that particular work at the ideological level. That seems sort of problematic. What do you say? Particularly given what you just said about wanting
it's not cancellation, but excuse me. I'm going to surprise you, Mark. I'm not a fan of Nicole Hannah-Jones's work or of her Twitter feed. but the trustees of UNC could well have seen their way to giving her tenure. They could well have seen her way to doing it. I grant you that she's perfectly qualified for a position, which is a professor of practice. It's an academic position of somebody who has achieved frontline accomplishment in the field of journalism. They could have granted her tenure. And I grant you that the fact that she's a controversial woman who headed up a controversial project at the New York Times made it probably easy for some of those trustees to see they were clear to saying no. It was their call. They said no for the time being, but she wasn't canceled. She still can have the position with a renewable contract, and she may yet get tenure there if she wants it. But I agree with you that that was a political move.
It was absolutely a political move. I mean, fortunately, tomorrow, the Board of Trustees, because of the activism, because of the public resistance, will be voting on her tenure, and will decide whether or not she will be a tenured faculty member at UNC or whether she will be what I would call canceled by the right, at least in the domain of academia. And I think you'd agree that. I was just going to say, go ahead, Glenn. I'm going to give you the last word.
No, I was just going to say, if you were a betting man, I'll bet you she gets it. Now that the light is shining and everybody can see what's going on, my bet is that she gets it.
No, I think so too, man. You know, a lot of times the powerful are like cockroaches, man. They do whatever they want when nobody's looking. You flick that light on, they start scurrying, man. Anyway, Glenn, thank you so much for joining me. You got to come back soon, man.
Okay, that's good.